Good afternoon, Congress. Thanks. Let me give a big thank you to UNI for this invitation to participate in the 4th World Congress. And I'd like to join Comrade Vavi, who thanked UNI this morning for holding its 4th Congress in Africa. The Africa Rising Initiative, or narrative, is one that we hear a lot today. And I think it's important that we have this narrative because of the optimism and hope that it generates. But in truth, this narrative needs to be informed by a proper appraisal, a fuller appraisal of the African condition and the effort that we need to realize the hopes that are generated by the narrative of Africa Rising. So we pose a question as to how inclusive Africa Rising is. How inclusive is it for the large contingents of workers, both urban and rural, on this continent, and especially for the large numbers of youth growing up in Africa? Today, we know that the population of Africa has exceeded the 1 billion mark. And we also learn that out of this population, about 60% is under 25 years. Some of them, of course, fall part already of the labor force. In the UN report on World Economic Situation and Prospects for 2014, robust economic growth is registered for the past decade in Africa and is expected to continue in the coming years. That is what gives rise to the narrative of Africa Rising. So Africa is reported to have maintained an average growth of about 4% compared to a global 3% in 2013. And indeed, some parts of the continent are even reported to have performed above 6%. The growth for 2015 is expected to be rising. But of course, the growth performance varied widely according to different country classifications and regions. But despite the strong economic performance over the past decade, many countries on the continent are grappling with several development challenges, ranging from food insecurity, high unemployment, poverty and inequality, about which we have heard so much today, to commodity dependence, environmental degradation, low integration of our continent, of the economies on this continent, and also, very significantly, lack of economic transformation. When we take the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, Africa is reported to have made some progress in achieving some of the goals, but clearly, we did not even come up to half. And out of the 8 MDGs, it's only 3 which were reported to be on track, namely the question of achieving universal primary education, promoting gender equality and empowering women, and then combating HIV and AIDS, tuberculosis, and other diseases. A quick look at employment. paints a grim picture on this continent. And since yesterday, we have been hearing different accounts of the nature of precarious work in all the regions, including Africa. In the Global Employment Trend Report of the ILO for 2014, we are told that in fact, over 77% of the working age population in Africa are in vulnerable jobs, with women being the most affected in this regard. When you listen to the formal figures on employment and unemployment, you will think that the situation is fairly okay. But then, in reality, even where people appear to be employed on this continent, many of them are in vulnerable employment. When Keith led his campaign team to present the numbers, he said 40% on the average in vulnerable employment. I can tell you that that is just an average, and that in some countries on this continent, we have as much as 80 to 85% in the informal economy, which is signified essentially or characterized largely by precarious work. We look at poverty, and we learn that about 45% Africans live on less than $1.25 a day. And that's also an average, because we are talking about a range of 84% living under $1.25 a day in Liberia to 5% in Gabon. And poverty in Africa hits women more than men. We look at health, and we find that HIV and AIDS, malaria and tuberculosis among HIV-negative people remain the main causes of morbidity among African people. And for these three diseases, the number of deaths per 100,000 in the Africa region 2 years ago, which was recorded, was 139 for every 100,000 people from HIV/AIDS, 72 for malaria, and 26 for tuberculosis. And this is in the African region. Whilst if you look at the Americas, for instance, the numbers there were 12 for HIV/AIDS, 0.2 for malaria, and 2.2. Today, we all know about the Ebola crisis, which has become a major public health crisis in West Africa especially. We take a look at education. And today, of course, we can say that there has been some improvement in education delivery on this continent. And that, based on current trends, 59% of 20 to 24-year-olds will have secondary education by 2030, compared to 42% today. But we also know that many schools lack basic facilities, and our universities on this continent suffer from overcrowding, and many staff are lured away by higher pay and better conditions to other countries. Besides, education content has never been fully adapted to the emancipatory needs of African societies, being largely influenced by curricula that was developed from colonial times. Our education, unfortunately, is not teaching us our history and helping us to look at ourselves closely and what we need to develop as a people. To do that, we have to do a lot of self-education in this movement. So if I were to take an example from what our sister who led the last team of cleaning workers, who suggested that they are at the bottom of the heap, I would say that if we look at the regions, Africa today is at the bottom of the heap. But it is not all grim, because we know that we have resources on this continent. We have human beings, a young population, and we have also natural resources. According to a UNECA report, that is UN Economic Commission for Africa report, which 3 years ago was on the theme of minerals and Africa's development. Africa has mineral deposits, which can be classified into 3 categories. The precious metals, that's gemstones and semi-precious stones, metallic minerals, and industrial minerals. And overall, Africa is reported to hold more than 30% of the world's mineral reserves. I'm sure many of us are also familiar about the fact that huge deposits of oil abound around the continent. The tragedy relating to mineral wealth, however, is that little has been done to add value, and that most of it is exported in raw form. So our mineral sector is noted for capital outflows, huge, and for the reluctance of multinational companies to transparently declare incomes in that area, as well as the exploitation of the weak and institutional frameworks in many of our countries. Weak legal and institutional frameworks in many of our countries. 5 years ago, in 2009, given the recognition of the importance of minerals on this continent, the AU adopted an African mining vision. A vision which is essentially aimed at ensuring that we add value to our minerals on this continent, that we leverage the mineral resources to help us industrialize, and also that the mining sector develops linkages with other sectors of our economies. And in line with the Agenda 2063, that is the vision of 50 years adopted by the AU talks about an integrated, in fact, it sets out an integrated program and people-centered Africa, at peace with itself and taking its rightful place in the world. As part of carrying this program forward, the chairperson of the AU said earlier this year, in this very city, at a mining in Daba, that the aspirations of the African people are simple. They are for a continent with shared prosperity, where they are not paupers, while the riches are taken from the soil and bowels of the African earth, often with their own sweat, blood, and effort, and are shipped elsewhere. African people's aspirations are that this situation must change. That was the chairperson of the AU. So, in coming back to the Africa narrative, Africa Rising narrative, there are a number of challenges that face us. The challenge of good governance, which many of us know, is a huge one. Sometimes when you reflect and ask yourself, what government is progressive on this continent? It is difficult to identify one. So the challenge of good governance and democratic participation is one that we can't argue about. But there is also the challenge of regional integration and industrialization. Because we know that given the challenges of development, where multinationals are powerful and where every region of the world looks out for itself, you need muscle to negotiate your way through the world. So regional integration in Africa is a must, which has long been recognized, but towards which very little has been done. So we come to the trade union movement in Africa, a movement that we know that at most critical times in our history has risen up to the challenge and made important contribution towards progress. But a movement which today itself faces enormous challenges that we must work to overcome if we want to be relevant to the challenges that confront Africa today. So we look at our movement, and one of the key elements that we see is that we have low trade union density. Among working people, our organization is very small. We take rough estimates of Africa's labor force today at 500 million, and we don't know that 50 million are organized into unions. So union density is very low. Apart from the fact that union density is low, there is too much division among our unions. Division and fragmentation. I was listening to one of our speakers, a young unionist, and he talked about a number of unions within the media, for instance. And you find that all over, there's fragmentation within our unions. And it comes right to the top at regional level. And when we are weak and fragmented, we are easily subject to manipulation by the powers that be, by our employers and our governments. And when we have weak unions, we have weaker national centers. Where our unions are strong, they don't do very much to support their national centers. The result is that many of our unions are also very dependent. We don't make use of our numbers to become strong so that we can do the things that we want to do. For this reason, the organizing agenda of the ITUC is one that I believe we all need to take up with vigor. If we want our economies to include us, if we want progress to include us, include you and me, as our theme for this Congress suggests, we need to take the organizing agenda serious. I've been privileged to listen to many accounts since yesterday about the stories of union organizing around the world and of achievements. And I believe that those of you in uni who cover so many sectors need to do even more to reach out. Listening to the range of sectors that uni covers, if you cast your minds to this continent, you will find that for every formal sector area that uni covers, there is an informal sector component. What are we doing to reach out to this section of the working population? Then we have the problem of internal democracy in our unions and low levels of accountability. If indeed we want to make a change, we want to contribute to a change, then it cannot be business as usual. If we want our unions to become strong and to grow, we cannot behave like our politicians who betray the people and at the same time be able to challenge these politicians. We need to be more serious in the way we develop accountability in this movement to be able to work for change and transformation. But we also need to clarify to ourselves what we want. When we look at our own history on this continent, especially in the immediate post-independence era for many of our countries, the state had a strong role in our economies. And we look at our countries today and we find that whatever modest investments in infrastructure that we had, the little industrialization that we had, most of it came from that era of strong state intervention. In the 70s, neoliberalism became the mantra around the world. Everything privatization, privatization, as if there was no role for the state. So we know about structural adjustment. And many of us in the union movement know that structural adjustment cost us dearly. So in the past 2-3 decades, we know that the world has developed. There is more technology in the world. There is more wealth. That there is more poverty and more inequality at the same time. There is more precarious work. There is less security for working people. We need to put back on the table squarely for ourselves the question of ideology and what is important for us. What body of ideas will help us to advance the cause of working people? So the labor movement, both in Africa and elsewhere, needs to take its place in organizing and mobilizing to challenge the dominant thinking of today and the policies which lead to growing inequality and greater poverty for the people. Because at the end of the day, if we look at the world's condition today, we cannot say that it's a question of absence of health, of wealth. It is more a question of distribution of the wealth that has been generated from the toil of working men and women. Over the last year, a number of campaigns have begun within the international trade union movement for tax on financial transactions, for tax justice, to stop illicit financial flows out of our countries, for minimum wages, and for social protection floors. All these are important engagements for us, and they are important first steps that we must take if we want to ensure that we get fully included in the benefits that come from our economies. So we need to ask ourselves, where do we fit in these struggles at national level? Where do we fit in these struggles at sectoral level, where we can make our presence fully felt? And what can we do to faithfully protect our workers? First, in the world of work, to fight for better wages and living wages, and to secure social protection for all. What can we do to extend union organization, particularly covering the youth and empowering them? Because the African population is predominantly youthful. But many times when we go to trade union meetings, the youth are not a predominant part of the gathering. Those are questions that we can only settle at national level and within the sectors where we really are working. What can we do as unions to reach out to other sectors of society who also have a stake in transformation for our societies? One speaker said earlier this afternoon that we must see the labor movement as part of a contingent of progressive forces. We occupy the labor section. We can't do it alone. There are many others who are also interested in transformation. What do we do to reach out to them? What can we do to strengthen our unions in policy development and in our ability to push our governments in the directions that we want them to go? Because politicians only respond to pressure. We need to work to strengthen the commitment of our governments to progressive decisions that they make at African regional level. Whenever our governments get together at African regional level, they make important decisions, but then once they get back to their national levels, they don't work. They don't implement these decisions. They don't follow up on them. So you take the African mining vision, for instance, and very few governments have worked to domesticate this, even though mining is important for many of our countries, with more than 45 countries having different deposits of different minerals. So, dear brothers and sisters, the answers lie in our own hands, in our readiness to speak truth to each other and to work together to bring much needed benefits to our members and our people. Let us rise up together and take charge of our destinies. Amandla.